Every night at the National Infantry Museum, he walked past the World War II display with a flashlight and clipboard. Just another elderly security guard making his rounds. Visitors during the day would study the artifacts, read the plaques, try to imagine what those battles were like. None of them knew that the quiet man who watched over their exhibits at night had actually been there. At Normandy, at the Bulge, at the liberation of concentration camps. The living witness to history, invisible among the relics of his own war. Welcome to Everyday Legends. Before we continue this powerful story, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. Because sometimes history walks among us and we never even know it. The National Infantry Museum stood like a monument to courage just outside Fort Moore, Georgia. During the day, it bustled with school groups, military families, and history enthusiasts who came to learn about America's ground forces. But at night, when the last visitor left and the lights dimmed, the museum became something else entirely. A cathedral of memory, where the ghosts of wars past seemed to whisper in the silence. That's when Harold "Hal" Winters began his shift. At 78 years old, Hal had been the night security guard at the museum for 12 years. Every evening at 6 p.m. he'd arrive in his beat-up Honda Civic, park in the employee lot, and clock in for another 8-hour shift. Gray uniform pressed and clean, black flashlight heavy on his belt, clipboard in hand. To anyone watching, he was just another elderly man supplementing his retirement income with part-time work. But Hal Winters carried secrets that would have rewritten every exhibit in the building. Born in 1945 in rural Alabama, Hal had lied about his age to enlist in the Army at 17. It was 1943, World War II was raging, and every young man wanted to do his part. By the time the Army discovered his real age, Hal had already proven himself in basic training. They let him stay. What followed were 2 years that would define not just Hal's life, but the course of history itself. Private Harold Winters, 82nd Airborne Division, had jumped into Normandy on D-Day, had fought through the hedgerows of France, had endured the brutal winter of the Battle of the Bulge, had been among the first Allied soldiers to liberate a concentration camp. But when the war ended and Hal came home, he did what so many veterans of his generation did. He put his uniform away and never talked about it again. Now, 7 decades later, Hal walked through museum halls filled with artifacts from his own life, his own war. Uniforms like the one he'd worn, weapons like the ones he'd carried, maps of battles where he'd shed blood. And nobody knew. The museum's World War II section was Hal's favorite and most painful part of his nightly rounds. The centerpiece was a massive diorama depicting the D-Day landings, complete with landing craft, beach obstacles, and figures of paratroopers descending from the sky. Visitors would stand transfixed, trying to imagine the courage it took to jump into that inferno. If they only knew that the man who unlocked the doors each morning had been one of those paratroopers. Private First Class. Sarah Martinez was a young Army historian assigned to the museum. Fresh out of graduate school with a master's degree in military history, she was passionate about preserving the stories of America's warriors. She'd been working at the museum for 6 months, and like everyone else, she barely noticed the night security guard. That changed on a cold Tuesday evening in November. Sarah had stayed late to finish cataloging a new donation, a collection of personal items from a World War II veteran's estate. Letters, photographs, medals, and a worn leather journal filled with handwritten accounts of combat. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't realize how late it had gotten until she heard footsteps in the corridor. "Hello?" she called out, looking up from the journal. "Evening, miss," came a gentle voice. It was Hal, making his rounds. "Working late tonight?" "Sorry, I didn't realize it was past closing. I got caught up in this donation." Sarah gestured to the items spread across her desk. "It's fascinating stuff. This soldier's journal is incredible." Hal paused, his flashlight beam catching the worn leather cover. "Mind if I take a look?" Sarah hesitated. Museum protocol was strict about handling artifacts, but Hal seemed genuinely interested, and she could use a break. I suppose it's okay. Just be careful, it's quite old. Hal set down his clipboard and picked up the journal with surprising gentleness. His weathered fingers traced the cover before opening to a random page. Sarah watched his eyes move across the handwritten text, and something in his expression changed. June 6th, 1944, Hal read aloud quietly. Jumped at 1300 hours, landed in a field about 2 miles from our objective. Enemy fire everywhere. Lost my rifle in the jump. Had to fight with a pistol and whatever I could find. Never been so scared in my life, but couldn't let the boys down. Hal's voice caught slightly on the last words. Sarah noticed his hands trembling almost imperceptibly. Are you okay? She asked. Hal quickly closed the journal and handed it back. Fine, miss. Just brings back memories. Memories? My father served in the war, used to tell stories. Hal picked up his clipboard. I should continue my rounds. But as he turned to leave, Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip. In the fluorescent light of her office, she could see a small tattoo on Hal's forearm, partially hidden by his sleeve. The distinctive wings and parachute of an airborne unit. Hal, she called out. He stopped but didn't turn around. That journal entry, you read it like you'd heard it before. Hal remained silent for a long moment. Then, without turning around, he said quietly, Some stories stay with you, miss. Even the ones you wish you could forget. And with that, he disappeared into the darkened corridor, leaving Sarah staring after him with 1,000 questions. The next few days, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about that moment. Something about Hal's reaction to the journal had struck her as more than just empathy. The way he'd read those words, the familiarity in his voice, the pain in his eyes. It was as if he'd lived that experience himself. But that was impossible. Hal was elderly, yes, but not nearly old enough to have served in World War II. Or was he? Sarah began paying more attention to Hal during his evening rounds. She started staying late more often, ostensibly to work, but really to observe. And the more she watched, the more she noticed things that didn't quite add up. The way Hal moved through the museum wasn't like someone learning the layout over 12 years. It was like someone who knew the weight of history in every display case. When he passed the Normandy diorama, he always slowed down, his eyes scanning the scene with an intensity that seemed personal. When he reached the exhibit on the Battle of the Bulge, she noticed his shoulders tense, as if the memories were too close to the surface. And then there were the small corrections. Sarah overheard him talking to the day security supervisor about a newly installed plaque describing paratrooper equipment. That's not quite right, Hal had said quietly. The reserve chute was worn lower, and the ammunition pouches were positioned differently for better balance during the jump. When asked how he knew such specific details, Hal had just shrugged and said he'd read a lot of books, but Sarah was beginning to suspect that Hal's knowledge came from a very different source. She decided to do some research. The museum kept personnel files on all employees, but Hal's was surprisingly thin. Basic information. Harold Winters, born 1945, hired 2011, clean background check, no military service listed. But something nagged at Sarah. The birth year seemed convenient. Working late one evening, Sarah accessed the museum's computer system and began cross-referencing military databases with Hal's information. What she found made her heart race. There was no Harold Winters born in 1945 with Hal's Social Security number. But there was a Harold Winters born in 1926, making him not 78, but 97 years old. And that Harold Winters had a military service record that read like a history book. 82nd Airborne Division, combat service in Europe, multiple commendations, wounded twice, presented D-Day, and the liberation of Dachau concentration camp. The man walking the halls of the museum each night wasn't just a security guard. He was a living piece of the history he protected. Sarah's hands shook as she printed the service record. Everything made sense now. The familiarity with equipment details, the personal reaction to combat accounts, the way he moved through the exhibits like he was visiting old friends or old battlefields. Sarah knew she had to confront him carefully. Hal had obviously hidden his identity for a reason. The next evening, when Hal appeared for his rounds, Sarah was ready. "Hal, I know who you are." He slowly sat down across from her desk, suddenly looking every one of his 97 years. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "I just figured it out. Harold Winters, born 1926, 82nd Airborne. You jumped into Normandy on D-Day." Hal nodded slowly. "I wondered if someone would eventually put it together." "Why hide it? You're living history." Hal stared at his hands that had once gripped a rifle on the beaches of Normandy. "Miss Martinez, do you know what it's like to be the last one? The last one from my unit, my company, probably my entire division who's still breathing. Everyone I served with is gone." Sarah felt tears welling up. "For 70 years I've carried their stories, but every time I tell someone about D-Day, I have to relive watching Bobby Henderson get cut down by machine gun fire. Every time I mention the Bulge, I see Tommy Rodriguez freezing to death in a foxhole. So I stopped talking about it. I let people think I was too young to have been there, and for the first time in decades, I found peace. But working here, surrounded by these exhibits, doesn't that make it harder?" Hal smiled sadly. "Actually, it's comforting. These displays tell the story without me having to. The history is preserved, and I can just watch over it all, make sure the story stays safe. Like a guardian." "Like a guardian," he agreed. Over the following months, Sarah became Hal's unofficial confidant. Slowly, carefully, he began sharing stories, not just about combat, but about the men he'd served with, moments of humanity that persisted even in war. Sarah learned that Hal had carried a picture of his girlfriend through the entire war, that he'd taught himself harmonica to entertain his unit during cold nights in foxholes, that he'd given his Purple Heart to his squad leader's widow because he felt she deserved it more. One evening in late spring, Hal didn't show up for his shift. Sarah learned he'd had a mild heart attack and was in the hospital. When she visited him, Hal looked smaller, more fragile. "I don't think I'll be coming back to work," he said quietly. "The doctors want me to retire." "Hal, would you consider letting me record some of your stories? For the museum archives, for future historians." Hal was quiet for a long time. "You really think they're worth preserving?" "You're not just a veteran, Hal. You're a witness, and witnesses have a responsibility to testify. Even when the testimony is painful. Especially then." Hal nodded slowly. "All right, but we do it right. No hero worship, just the truth." Over several months, Sarah recorded interviews with Hal. He talked about the terror of jumping into occupied France, the chaos of D-Day, the friends he'd lost, but also about unexpected moments of kindness, acts of humanity that persisted in war. "The hardest part wasn't the fighting," Hal said during one interview. "It was figuring out how to live with what I'd seen. How do you go back to worrying about everyday problems when you've seen people die for freedom?" When Hal passed away peacefully at age 99, Sarah made sure he received full military honors. The museum held a memorial service and unveiled a new exhibit, Harold Winters, Guardian of Memory. The centerpiece was a placard that read, "For 12 years, Harold Winters worked as night security guard at this museum. Visitors would study our World War II exhibits, trying to understand what that generation experienced. They never knew that one of the men who'd lived that history was watching over their learning." Harold Winters, paratrooper, veteran, guardian. As Sarah watched visitors read Hal's story, she saw amazement in their eyes as they realized history had been walking among them. Most importantly, she saw people leave with a different understanding of service, not just dramatic moments of courage, but the quiet, daily choice to care for something bigger than yourself. Harold Winters had served twice, once as a young paratrooper who helped liberate Europe, and again as an elderly guard who preserved the memory of that liberation. Both forms of service were heroic. Sometimes history walks among us in the form of a quiet old man with a flashlight, making sure stories of sacrifice are never forgotten. So tell us, have you ever met someone ordinary who lived through extraordinary events? Someone whose quiet presence carried the weight of history? Share their story, because the most important stories are often the ones that almost go untold. If this story touched you, subscribe and share. Because people like Harold Winters are walking among us, living bridges between past and present, guardians of memory. See you in the next story. And remember, sometimes the most profound recognition comes from finally seeing the hero who was there all along.